Greetings! Have you ever wanted to sit down with Wernher von Braun and ask him what his thought processes were when he was designing the Saturn V rocket? Or maybe you've wanted to sit down with Albert Einstein and ask him about all the intricacies of general relativity and maybe yell at him for preventing FTL drives from working? Well, I have great news for you. We're going to be doing exactly that. Well, not with Albert Einstein and Wernher von Braun, obviously, but we will be getting genuine space legends, actual experts in their field, and they'll be our teachers, explaining all of the different subjects that we're interested in. And it will even be interactive, so you can ask them questions too. So, I'm sure most of you will recognise this. And I'm certain that most of you will also recognise this. Well, guess what? Our teacher for this masterclass designed both of these things, and now he's going to be teaching us this. That teacher is of course none other than the rocket legend himself, Alan Bond. So this course is going to be going on for about a year, and there are going to be new episodes coming out each week. But Alan doesn't just want you to watch all of the new episodes. He also wants this course to be interactive. So please, ask questions in the comments, post your thoughts on the forums. We're going to try and get to answering as many of them as possible. And yeah, that's about it. Don't forget, there will be other courses in other subjects if rocket propulsion isn't your thing. But for now, let's get into the course.
Thank you, Clarence. I'm very pleased to be here. And of course, this book is, every rocket engineer has got a copy of some edition of this book on their shelves. A long time ago, the second edition was my start to a serious rocket analysis. And so I'm delighted to be able to do an introduction with this book. I think, looking at this book, that chapter 1 is pretty much self-explanatory. That's just a discussion of the different propulsion systems that are available, and it's a very easy reading. And so I think that we will probably pick up the discussion chapter 2 onwards. And what I'll do as I go through this with you over the sort of coming weeks is précis what's in the actual chapter, and I'll try to fill in some extra little bits of background where it occurs to me as we work our way through the book. But I think we're going to have a lot of fun with it.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Alright, let's get into the course.
So what I'd like to do is to just lead you through what chapter 3 actually covers and what it's about. So essentially, one of the things that this does is assume perfect gases.
Right.
So an important thing about perfect gases is that all the properties like the specific heat is constant, the molecular weight is constant,
Right.
so that that is an approximation. In a real rocket engine, those things aren't constant, but this is a good starting point.
Right.
You'll get within 5 or 10% of the right answer if you follow these calculations.
Yeah.
So in the first part of chapter 3 is just an introductory part of it. And at 3.2, what George Sutton does is introduce us to essentially the conservation of energy. Now in gases, there are 2 types of energy that one can consider. There's the internal energy. So I've got some gas in a box, I put some heat into it, and the temperature goes up. And so the amount by which the temperature goes up depends on the specific heat at constant volume in those circumstances.
Right.
But there's another possibility, and that is the lid of the box might have some weights on it.
Right.
And as I raise the temperature, the pressure remains constant because it's lifting the lid.
Oh, so the combustion chamber expands.
So in this case, we're not actually talking about the combustion chamber itself at the moment, we're just talking about a box of gas. And as the lid lifts and I put heat into it, some work is done in lifting that lid.
Right.
And so that's the specific heat at constant pressure. The volume of the box is now changing. So we have 2 very important specific heats, one at constant volume and one at constant pressure. And what constantly shows up in the equations that we're going to use is the ratio of those 2, Cp divided by Cv, the specific heats ratio. Very important parameter when we're talking about the expansion of a gas. Now, Annoyingly, George Sutton, right from 1948 in his first volume, always calls that ratio K. Everybody else in the known universe uses the Greek letter gamma.
Okay.
So the people that we're addressing here, when they come across other work than George Sutton, may find gamma, but gamma is K in George Sutton's book.
Right.
So when we look at the energy of a flowing system, we use something called enthalpy, which is the internal energy plus the work that's done in compression, and we call that enthalpy.
Right.
And all the calculations for a flowing system are done in terms of enthalpy. So when we get to equations 3.2, etc., through this book, we'll find that we've got the changes in enthalpy,
Right.
and we've got the specific heat ratio, K in this case. Now, energy can't be created or destroyed, and so the first thing that George Sutton shows is that as the flow is expanding, the enthalpy in the flow decreases.
Right.
And where did that energy go? It went into accelerating the gas.
Right.
So the velocity of the gas that we've got is a function of how much the enthalpy has fallen. And so there's a very simple equation: change in enthalpy equals the change in kinetic energy of the gas flowing through the nozzle.
Okay.
And he covers that very quickly and succinctly. How do we find out what the enthalpy of a gas is? Well, it's essentially the specific heat at constant pressure times the temperature, absolute temperature of the gas. Okay. So very quickly we put in the absolute temperature, and that enables us to say, if I've got a gas, the temperature change is such and such, then the change in kinetic energy is going to be something else.
Yeah.
Very easily calculated. Now we come to some slightly more difficult calculation, because if we've got a balloon and we've got the balloon in this room at atmospheric pressure, and then we pump down the external pressure, the gas in the balloon obviously expands and the balloon gets bigger.
Right.
In the process of doing that, the balloon has done work on the gas in the room and the temperature has fallen.
Right.
So there is something called the isentropic pressure-temperature relations, and that is a little bit more complicated, because the temperature ratio is equal to the pressure ratio raised to some power of the specific heat ratio.
Right.
We don't need to go into the detail of what that is. George Sutton writes it all down for us in this book, and he then develops this through. There's also a volume relation, so the pressure ratio, the temperature ratio, the volume ratio of a perfect gas are all related through the specific heat ratio.
Okay.
Now, if we've got a perfect gas with constant molecular weight and constant specific heat ratio, we can derive something called the Mach number. The Mach number is simply equal to the actual velocity of the gas divided by the speed of sound in the gas.
Okay, right, because different gases would have different speeds.
And that depends on the molecular weight and the specific heat ratio. So helium, low molecular weight, high specific heat ratio, velocity of sound is much higher than in air, for example, where air has got 7 times the molecular weight of helium, and therefore the speed of sound is square root, as it turns out, of 7 slower. There's also a change in the specific heat ratio. So the Mach number is quite a useful parameter, because if we've got a flowing gas and we use the Mach number, all the equations actually come out rather simple.
Okay.
And it's unfortunate that we'd like to derive things directly, like the area ratio to the pressure ratio of a rocket nozzle, for example.
Right.
But it turns out that that's a horrendous mathematical complicated problem, and not much use even if you do it. But if you do it as Mach number, then you can work out the area ratio as a function of Mach number, you can work out the pressure ratios, the temperatures, all as a function of Mach number. And then if you've got an area ratio, relate that to the Mach number, and then go via the Mach number back to the pressure ratio and the temperature
so you
ratio.
just need to know the speed of sound in the gas.
So, and that's easy to calculate. Now, because in a rocket nozzle, as the gas flows down the nozzle, the temperature's falling, the speed of sound in the gas is also falling. The hotter a gas, the higher the speed of sound. So if we've got to a point in a rocket nozzle where the Mach number is, say, 5, then we go to another point in the rocket nozzle where the Mach number is, say, 3. You've got to be careful because the speed of sound is different in those two places. So the place in where it is 5 is not 5 over 3 times the speed of where it was 3, because the temperature's fallen as the flow expanded and the Mach number is lower, so the actual velocity is lower than 5 over 3 times where the Mach number was 3.
Okay. And those 5 and 3, those are placeholder units. You would use meters per second, I presume?
Yeah, I mentioned 5 because rocket nozzles, typically big rocket nozzles, operate around about a Mach number of 5. It varies. A very high area ratio nozzle will be much higher, and a lower area ratio nozzle will be much lower.
What are the units on those?
So for Mach number, it's dimensionless. It's a velocity of the flow in meters per second divided by the speed of sound in meters per second. So the Mach number is just a number. It's the velocity, how big the velocity is relative to the speed of sound.
Okay, I see.
And here, George Sutton gives us some equations to calculate the Mach number, and then he gives a nice graph simply to show how that varies. So we divide flows normally into Mach numbers less than 1, subsonic, and Mach numbers greater than 1, supersonic. Now, why do we do that? If you imagine a point on a nozzle wall and the flow is somewhere in the convergent where it's subsonic, then the pressure at that point on the wall can in principle influence the whole flow, because the actual disturbances that that point on the wall cause spread out into the flow at the speed of sound. And since the flow is travelling less than the speed of sound, that point can influence the whole flow field. When we get above the speed of sound, that changes dramatically, because a point on the wall now, the pressure wave travels out into the flow at the speed of sound, but the flow is travelling faster than the speed of sound, so that can only influence, as it propagates into the stream, points downstream of that point. It cannot travel upstream. So if I've got a rocket nozzle and I do something downstream of that, what we call Mach line, then I can change the nozzle and it won't influence at all what happened above that point, because that point cannot have its pressure propagate back upstream.
Okay, so there are points where if something occurs in the nozzle below that point, it's physically impossible for a pressure wave to get back up and ruin your day.
Absolutely correct.
Okay.
Now, there's one area that we come to a bit later in this chapter which is very important, and that's the boundary layer and the external pressure, because with boundary layers in the sort of gases we're dealing with, the velocity of flow at the actual wall and in a very small region next to the wall is subsonic.
Oh, like boundary flow on an aircraft?
Yes.
Okay.
So the actual flow at the wall is 0, in fact. The fluid is not moving at the wall. That's different if you get to very low densities.
That makes sense. The wall would provide friction to slow it down.
So the friction slows it right down, and so the fluid is effectively anchored to the wall at these sort of pressures and densities that we're talking about. And then there's a region in the boundary layer where the flow is subsonic, and so pressure waves can travel up the boundary layer, but not in the bulk flow. And we'll come back to why that's important in a while.
Okay, so we think that's a good place to pause. We're going to stop here and pick it up the exact same place next week. In the meantime, make sure you write all of your questions down in the comment section, and we'll see if we can get around to answering them in future installments. See you next time.